Night shifts teach you one thing fast. The dark hides a lot more than dust. It hides grief, it hides desperation, it hides people who only come alive when everyone else is asleep. If you work nights, or if you ever plan to, you should hear these 5 stories. They're true, they're ugly, and they'll make you look twice at the next quiet aisle, the empty barn, the dim gas pump. Content warning up front. These stories include violence, mental illness, and threats. If that's likely to be triggering for you, take care. Otherwise, stay with me. Some of these endings are mercifully ordinary, but the road to them is anything but. I'll be reading these in the order they were sent. Each comes from someone who actually lived it. I'm the one stitching the threads, but the voice you'll hear in each block is theirs. The large animal vet with mud on her boots, the grocery third shifter with a deadpan sense of humor, the 22-year-old gas station attendant who got forced into nights, the red-eye air hostess who learned why you never trust a quiet cabin, and the nurse who thought the worst thing in a coma ward would be boredom. I'll stop between them to breathe and to tease what comes next. No dramatics, just the facts, the fear, and the dark laughs people use to keep going. Story 1. The Vet. The Ranch at Midnight. They called me at 2 in the morning because horses don't care about schedules. They hurt, they panic, and someone has to be awake to sort the mess. That night, my phone lit up with a name I knew, Mr. Capson, so I tossed on boots, grabbed my kit, and drove out past the last streetlight. The dirt road was a ribbon of black. The only light came from the truck's headlights and the dot of the ranch's porch lamp. I should have paid attention to the ATV tracks. It's a small sign, obvious in daylight, but easy to miss when you're thinking about a sick animal. A vehicle that isn't part of the household. Tracks cut into the wet shoulder like someone trying to erase themselves. That's what made my stomach tighten even before I got out of the truck. Irene met me at the gate. She was holding a thermos and didn't smile. The barn door was half open. There was the smell of hay, of ammonia, and something under it that made the air feel wrong, like smoke after a lightning strike, or the coppery bite of blood. Inside, Dapple stood trembling near his stall. He's a big horse. You don't miss the way a horse holds itself when it's in pain. Flat ears, a jaw that works like it's chewing grit. I was there for that. The call was about an abscess that had turned septic. I'd come prepared with antibiotics, sutures, and just in case, the small .22 pistol we keep in the vet box for humane euthanasia when nothing else works. It lives under gauze and towels and a bottle of disinfectant. Nobody thinks about it until they need it. I rounded the corner with my kit and saw a shadow in the loft. Someone was perched on the hayloft ladder, hunched. I assumed it was a kid playing pranks. Then the flashlight hit a face I recognized as Daniel's. Daniel, Mr. and Irene's son. He'd been off the rails for a while. Somebody told me his teeth were gone, that he'd been back from the city with empty pockets and colder eyes. I should have left right then. I should have turned the truck around and called it off. But there was a horse in pain, and you don't just walk away from that. Daniel wasn't alone. He had a shotgun. It was propped across his knee like a rodent on a mantle. He looked smaller than I remembered, not from height, but from everything else. Sleep-deprived, shaking, the skin around his eyes pale and thin. The shotgun's muzzle was pointed at his parents, as if it were the only steady thing in the barn. I remember the first thing he said. He wanted money, $30,000. He wanted the truck, the trailer, the money from the accounts, anything to get the chemical supplies and pay his supplier, his words slurred by something I'd heard before, need laced with nothing but desperation. He said if they didn't give it up, none of them would leave the barn. The caprine smell of fear replaced the horse's scent in my head. I had a kit and a license, and a habit of thinking like someone who patches up injuries, not like someone who negotiates with somebody holding a sorrow-shaped barrel. But when your hand lives near a pistol all day, you also know how quickly a threat can turn into a tragedy. I told Daniel my name. I told him I knew his parents. I told him I was there for the horse, that if anyone got hurt, I'd call the sheriff. He laughed once. It was a laugh that wanted to be a terrible movie villain, but landed as something flat and human. He said he didn't care about the sheriff. He said the sheriff was a story adults used to make kids behave. He said he just needed cash. I spoke slowly. I asked him to put the gun down. I told him a story about a horse that didn't want to be alone. I told him his father would do anything to save Dapple. I told him I'd treat the horse and deal with the money later. I was improvising. I didn't have a plan, I had a tone. The barn made every step sound larger. The shotgun slipped. Or maybe he let it, maybe he panicked. I don't know the precise physics of who released the tension first. The gun fired. The sound was small because it was a shotgun in a rafters and because adrenaline distorts noise. A spatter of pellets hit the ceiling and rained down like an angry confetti. Dust and small flame of insulation fell. Dapple reared. A bale of hay tilted. For a few seconds, everything was kinetic. Hoof, wood, screaming that sounded like a long animal. I grabbed the pistol from my belt. It wasn't a man-killer. It was a tool for putting a suffering animal out of its misery if needed. Its single shot, boring in the way that makes it steady. I pointed it at Daniel and spoke with the kind of voice I reserve for when a mare refuses to come in on her own. "Drop the gun," I said. It was flat. It was not heroic. The shotgun went clattering. It hit the floor and nearly rolled under a hay cart. Daniel scrambled backward, eyes wide. He fell off the loft steps and hit the floor like a bag of flour. He was crying. That was the thing. He was not some cartoon villain. He was a son with the barrel of a shotgun pressed against his soul and nothing to steady it. I knelt and kept my hand on the pistol because old habits die quick, and because the world had shifted under my feet, and now the people I knew and respected were at risk. We treated Dapple. He'd taken a few pellets. They lodged in a shoulder and in the flank, not a single one in a place that would have killed him instantly. I irrigated and probed and swore over clumsy instruments, and told myself the trauma would be remembered in veins and in a limp for a while, not in a headline. The infection had been brewing. The old abscess had burst when the pellets spooked him. I sutured and gave him antibiotics, enough to make me go through more paperwork than the rest of the night combined, and I fed him molasses like it was a peace offering. The police arrived later because someone had finally managed to call them once they could move without someone screaming. Daniel was taken away. Not cuffed like a movie arrest, but led, hands in his pockets, eyes hollow. Later, I learned he went to rehab. Later still, months down the line, Irene sent me a photo of Daniel walking into a job interview with a haircut and shoes that fit. Dapple lived a few more years. He died of age, not of the collision of desperation in a dirty barn. The fallout didn't happen in dramatic hearings. There were no documentaries. There were quiet things. The new lock on the feed shed, the neighbor who drove Mr. Capson to the store, the meals that arrived at the house because people could see the numbness in Irene's face and wanted to fix it with casseroles, and the conversation that came up every so often at conferences of people who patch up animals. They asked whether vets ought to carry firearms and what that meant. I don't have an answer beyond what I did. I kept the gun because sometimes mercy requires a tool that looks ugly, and I used my voice because sometimes words are the only thing between a person and a permanent decision. I thought a lot about choices after that, about how we all make tiny compromises when the dark comes, leaving doors unlocked because you'll be back in 5 minutes, nodding off at the wheel because sleep is a currency you can't afford. I thought about Daniel and the look on his face when the shotgun slid from his hands, how much of him was afraid, and how much of him was loss pretending to be anger. Rehab didn't turn him into a saint. It gave him a chance. That in the end is all any of us ever get. When I left the ranch, the sky was pale and the first crows were doing their morning rounds. I shut my truck door and pressed my forehead to the steering wheel for a long minute and felt ridiculous and hollow, and oddly privileged to have been there for the small messy saving of a horse and a man. That's the thing about nights. They give you a ledger of what you saved and what you couldn't. Irene called me later that week. She asked whether I'd been scared. I told her yes. She said she'd worried I'd been brave. I told her bravery is mostly habit and incompetence with panic. She laughed. Then she thanked me for treating Dapple. Then she told me how Daniel had written a short note, all shaky handwriting saying he wanted to try. Small moments like that outnumber any dramatic rescue. They're quieter. They're the stuff that helps people keep breathing. You think the barn was the scariest part of that night. Maybe it was. But what haunts me more is the way quiet can hide a gun between two broken people. What I learned was this. In the dark, practical things, antibiotics, a gun tucked in a kit, a steady voice, can matter in ways you never thought they would. You plan for lacerations and colic. You don't plan for grief pointing a barrel at your friends. When I tell this story now, when I tell it in waiting rooms, at small gatherings, at conferences, I don't say I was a hero. I say I was present. Presence is all you can owe another human. Presence is sometimes enough. Transition. Night removes witnesses. It hands you a few people and a problem and says, decide. Sometimes you decide well, sometimes not. Either way, the dark has a vote. Story 2. The grocery store, the fish counter. If you work the third shift in retail, you learn to measure time by inventory cycles and the way fluorescent lights hum when they're too old. My name's not important. I was the one who stacked cans and refilled the return carts, the one who learned which customers would come in at 2 a.m. and the ones who shouldn't be trusted with a coupon. The store was the size of a small supermarket, and the aisle lights made people look older. There were 3 of us on nights, me, Cherry, and the manager, who preferred to sleep in the office with a game on his phone rather than walk the floor. It felt safe most nights in that level, predictable way that only the mathematically exhausted can appreciate. The cooler hummed, the conveyor belts paused between deliveries, the city beyond the doors felt like a rumor. There was a knock on the glass of the fish display at about 4 in the morning. At first I thought it was a raccoon. We'd get critters trying to get at the garbage out back, until Cherry whistled, and I saw hands pressing on the glass from the inside. Then the lid opened, and out crawled an old person wrapped in layers of clothing like a forgotten spare. They looked at us with a wet, startled smile, and then did something so stupidly human I still taste the irony. They grabbed an octopus and bit it. Octopus is a weird thing to see in the middle of the night. Octopus doesn't scream. Octopus makes a mess. The denture thing happened too. The old person's teeth, false I assumed, clacked and got stuck in the display's icy surface like a set of sad tools. There was blood. There was fish slime. The person was raving, but not coherently. We pulled them out with the grace of 2 people who had had worse things to come in and worse things to happen. We shouldn't have pried, but someone has to stop a scene before it becomes a worse scene. They smashed a tray of fillets on the floor and then attacked Cherry. Not an immediate full-on assault, more like a flailing, desperate thing, hands flinging towards anyone who looked like a hand that could be a way back to a life that made sense. The old person stood up and staggered, hands covered in scales and ice and blood. Cherry got cut by a shard of glass when the display broke. She's a tough one. She's the sort of person who washes her hands in the mop sink and jokes about it later. But she's also the sort who looks at you with real anger when someone threatens the people who work nights. We held the door, and we called the cops, the ambulance, the manager. The attacker, because that's the word the reports later used, was eventually tased. He smoked like a man awakened from a long, strange dream. Later, the police said he'd been a fisherman, bankrupt, and living as his late wife. He'd apparently taken to wearing her clothes because it made him feel less alone. Grief does weird things. Psychosis does worse. The papers called it delusional behavior. The people who knew him said he'd cracked. Cherry recovered. She still carries the scar like a badge and tells new hires that if you hear smashing, you don't go in alone. The old man, he wasn't old, not in the way the body betrays some of us, went to psychiatric care. He didn't go to prison because there was sanity to be considered and he needed help more than a cell. The company paid for repairs. There was a memo about security protocols that everyone pretended to read. The regulars came back. Life rounded off. The smell of fish and broken glass clung to me for days. I'd wake up with it in the corners of my throat. I learned to notice odd things. The way someone touches their dentures. The way an abandoned life might fold around itself in a fluorescent-lit hour. Daylight dulled it the way sunlight always does. Daylight makes things mundane. But at 2 a.m. And when all the lights hummed and the registers clicked, that night felt like a proof that people can break in ways the law isn't designed to fix. Cherry and I made a little ritual after the incident. We kept a jar behind the counter labeled for replacement bandages. We'd drop a couple of dollars in after a rough night. We'd make terrible coffee and trade stories about nights that got worse than they should. Here's how you normalize the abnormal when you get stuck with it as your job description. After that, the store tightened up the cameras. They also installed a motion sensor by the fish case that clicked an alarm if the glass got reached through. No one liked the cameras. Privacy is always the price for safety, or so the memo said. The manager walked with a badge for a week to show solidarity. He stopped sleeping in the office. That lasted 2 days. What stuck with me, though, wasn't the violence itself. It was the odd, grotesque comedy of the whole thing. The person biting an octopus in the fish case is such a surreal image that later, when you tell someone who wasn't there, they laugh in the wrong way. They laugh because it's ridiculous, but there's a sharp edge to the laughter when you know someone nearly lost more than teeth. When Cherry went back to work, she kept her hair short. She said she wanted to feel less like something to be grabbed. That's how people change. They don't always conquer their fear. They rearrange themselves so the fear visits less often. We stayed on nights for a while after the incident. You keep working because your rent doesn't check your trauma before it demands payment. You count out your hours, you stock the shelves, you learn to be a little more watchful. Eventually I quit. Trade school, new dreams. But even now when I pass a seafood display, my stomach does the small leap it learned that night. Things you see at 3 a.m. lodge under your ribs. Soft CTA. If these sorts of stories are the kind you stay up for, hit subscribe and ring the bell. I'm not selling salvation. I'm selling a steady feed of other people's midnight proof that the world doesn't stop being dangerous when the sun goes down. One click keeps me fed and keeps the community of night workers coming back with more. Transition. Some nights unfold like a slow burn. Others are a match thrown into kerosene. The next one was a match. Story 3. The gas station, the dwarf who stood up. I was 22. My boss, Gary, had a habit of hiring people he thought he could scare into staying. He'd tell you the reason he kept me on nights was to teach me responsibility. The truth was uglier. He paid less for overnight labor and expected night workers to be less trouble. I worked the graveyard shift at a lonely gas station outside the city. Our spot was the kind that sells coffee, lottery tickets, and bad sandwiches. The fluorescent lights blinked if the power got surgy, and the pumps coughed in the winter. You learned to fix things with chewing gum and a certain amount of prayer. There were nights when the odd characters came by, kids looking for cheap thrills, truckers who never smelled anything but diesel, and the kind of drifter who looks like he has more geography in his backpack than sense. I learned to take the long stare with the eyeballs of someone who has seen worse and is trying not to care. The night he came in, it was slow and rainy. The station smelled like boiled coffee and rubber. I was behind the counter scrolling through the chain's scheduling app because nothing else demanded my attention when he walked in. He was small. He was the kind of small that made you underestimate him. Hunched shoulders, a cap pulled down, a coat that made his torso disappear into fabric. He had this little limp that made him shuffle at the knees. He looked like a dwarf. I say that because that's the immediate impression you get before people become complicated. In the fluorescent light, he looked like a small man who'd get less attention than gravity deserved. He bought a pack of gum, two-faced, and stood at the counter like he was counting his breaths. Then he pulled a piece of cloth from his pocket and pinned it like a badge. "Give the register," he hissed. I thought he was joking. I'd thrown worse. People in jackets get frantic. I put my hand into the till and half expected the usual threats, some shaky demands, and then I saw the barrel. It was a sawed-off shotgun shoved under his jacket. The small man's eyes were merciless. He wanted the register, he wanted the cash, he was angry and deficient, and felt like he deserved everything and nothing at once. The register opened with a brittle click. His hand went in. He slapped some bills into his coat. He shoved a cigarette in his mouth like he wanted a prop. Then he did something that made the whole scene flip. He crouched. He pulled his knees up, and in the tiny, cramped void behind the counter, he pretended to be shorter than he was. He grinned at me like a kid in a carnival trick. "Don't be a hero," he said, voice like gravel. I handed him more. I should have shouted. I should have smashed the emergency button. Instead, I made a terrible choice. I thought about my family, checking my shift hours, about getting home before dawn, about the small calculus of risk that always lives in a 22-year-old's head. I slid a 20 into his jacket and told him to take it and go. He didn't go straight away. He poked the hot dog warmer with the barrel. He shot the grill. I don't mean it as a dramatic detail. The hot dog unit cracked and hissed, and smoke rolled out like a serpent. The man laughed and then darted out the door with the register drawer clutched to his chest like a trophy. A weirdly domestic heist. I called it in. I did everything you're supposed to. I recited the description to dispatch in a voice that I hoped sounded resolute. It did for about 30 seconds. Then the adrenaline drained, and I started shaking so hard I had to put my knee against the counter to steady my hands. What I didn't know, because those things come later in ways that make the night longer than it needs to be, was that the dwarf act wasn't real. The cameras that the boss kept pointing to as a reason not to improve lighting caught something interesting. In the grainy footage, you can see him at the counter. You can see the crouch, you can see where the coat folds meet. Then, somewhere off frame, he straightens up. He's not 6 feet of menace yet. He's just a guy pretending to be small to get out of the frame. He's hiding the legs, bent, tucked, like a child playing a trick so obvious that no one believes it at first. Later, for the police, you'd give them the footage and they'd stare for long minutes because that's what evidence looks like. Mundane, until you realize how much it refuses to be small. Ballistics later tied the shotgun to a string of armed robberies at convenience stores 3 counties over. The register turned up in a pawn shop in a different town. The man was arrested months later after a neighbor's tip. They matched shell casings from his shooting of the hot dog unit to other sites. That's the postscript. That's the efficient, clean part that comes after the messy 5 minutes when your windows rattle and you think you might be dead. But I can tell you for the 5 minutes after he left, the world narrowed. The pumps ticked in a rhythm that sounded like a heart monitor. My hands were cold. Gary showed up 30 minutes later, eyes too bright, and smiled like a man who's seen his profits cut by human beings. He was mostly performative concern. "You okay?" he asked. His daughter, Lana, came by the next week, bringing me a thermos of mediocre soup and saying she'd heard. You think bosses will be supportive. Most of them will supply paperwork and guilt and then demand productivity. I quit 2 weeks later. I found a trade program. I got a roof. I stopped starting at silhouettes at the edge of parking lots. I met Lana, Gary's daughter, remember? She flirted awkwardly at my exit interview, and later more seriously at a community event. There's a stupid human thing where people act as if near disaster is an instrument of romance. We joked about it. I asked her out for coffee. She laughed and then asked me whether I'd try to teach her how to change a tire. We're not married yet, but we make jokes about the time I almost invested my life in a roll of quarters. That part, the minefield of what we do after the adrenaline, deserves its own chapter. People will call you brave and then expect you back at your job like nothing happened. Insurance forms will smile and demand signatures. The real fallout is your nights. The way strangers' silhouettes look like weapons. The way you flinch at doors. The way you keep scanning the room, even while you brush your teeth at dawn. Right then, though, as the rain smudged the neon and the pumps continued their slow, resigned cough, I leaned on the counter and watched the door like a person who had learned the hard lesson that anonymity is a tool for criminals. We get used to the idea that the night makes you invisible. Some people exploit it. Some people are exploited by it. You can't always tell which until the moment they stand up. I'm telling you this now and you'll say, why didn't you fight? The answer is a soft, honest one. I thought about my life and my debts and the hands of the person across the counter who could have pulled the trigger for reasons I don't understand. Fear is not glamorous. It's a ledger. You balance it. Sometimes you break even, sometimes you don't. The cameras showed the trick later. The footage made it easier for the police to follow the thread. But it didn't make me invincible. It didn't make the nights stop being nights. At that point in the story, the longer arc, ballistics, capture, and the legal aftermath, unfolded in the days and weeks after. But those belong to the parts of the narrative that let the dust settle enough for police work to begin. For now, imagine the rain washing down the pumps, the coffee burned and cold in the urn, and a man who looked too small to do much at all vanishing into the fog. Transition. Not every villain stays a villain. Sometimes they walk away and you only learn later that they were the worst kind, people who hide in plain sight. But not every terror is a person in disguise. Sometimes it's a seatbelt and a closed cabin, and a note folded into someone's pocket. End of this section. Story 4. The Red Eye, the air hostess who found a note. They teach you to read a cabin like a book. You learn which rows sleep like the dead, which passengers will ask for extra blankets, and which ones keep that watchful edge in their eyes. On red eyes, people trade the honesty of daytime for a weird, private anonymity. Everyone has reasons to be up. That anonymity can be a shelter or a trap. I learned that on a flight that should have been routine. I worked nights on long-haul flights when I was fresh on the roster. The red eye is an oddly reflective world. Dim lights, faces softened into masks, the cabin reduced to a narrow corridor where every sound is amplified. We glide through hours by serving a plastic cup of tea, by apologizing for turbulence, by whispering the same safety spiel until your voice is more rote than warning. I liked it. There's a rhythm to unpeopled hours that suits certain minds. The monotony is almost meditative. That particular flight left at midnight. People were sleep-heavy, clutching neck pillows like lifelines. I was on my third beverage round, carrying a trolley that smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic, when I bent down to collect a napkin someone had left on a tray table. The napkin had a note folded into it. I thought it was a comment card. I thought it was a joke. I unwrapped it and read, "I know what you did on that plane." You think you can laugh that off? You can't. It's a sentence with no context, and in context is a threat. For a second, my mouth went dry. You think about cameras in the cabin, and you think about passengers' faces in the dark. I put the napkin in my pocket because procedural instincts do that. You file evidence in the nearest pocket, and you tell your colleague. Ian, the man who had written the note, was a passenger in row 8. He looked ordinary at first glance, mid-30s, an approachable face if you squinted. He had a briefcase and an air about him like he belonged on a business trip. He kept watching me with too much attention for a stranger. At first I assumed he was one of those people who read cabin crews like fault lines, measuring your responses as if conducting a pre-interview. Then his attention turned into approach. He started asking questions. Little things at first, about duty-free returns, about the lavatory. Then he began calling me by name. How he knew my name I couldn't say. Maybe I'd introduced myself earlier to a sleeping passenger, or maybe he'd overheard a colleague. He said it like a trademark. He'd lean in at the galley door and smile too personally for someone we only share 5 hours with. I told myself he was lonely. That's the kind version of the thing you tell yourself when you want to keep working and not worry your passengers. Then the note was found. Then his voice changed. The smile thinned. He became possessive. He began to shadow my movements in that closeted way people do when they think they have a book on you. You practice de-escalation drills, but they are mostly about angry parents or drunk businessmen. They don't prepare you for someone who insists his grievance is private and damning at once. The napkin's words looped in my head. I know what you did on that plane. I tried to treat it as nonsense. I told myself it was some misdelivered joke. You do that because fear is expensive and you need your job tomorrow. Then he followed me into the galley. The galley is small. Metal counters, a sink that never drains fast enough, the microwave growl, a cabinet of coffee sachets. It's where the crew breathes and where secrets get accidentally confessed. I was stowing service items when I felt him behind me. He closed the galley door and pinned me into the corner with his body, like a smudge that would not be brushed off. His hands were sudden and rough. He pushed me against the metal, whispered a name I didn't know, and accused me of being someone else. Someone who had cheated him, he said. He gagged me with a hand over my mouth. He tried to drag his accusation into something physical. There are 1,000 small acts that stop you from acting. Shock is one. Training is another. Shape your hands to call an emergency. Use your knee to wedge between door frames. Keep your voice low, but urgent. I did some of that. I hit a panic button on my vest with my heel. I tried to make noise without making him angrier. I told him he was mistaken. I tried to reason. That's what people tell you to do. Speak softly. Name the breathing. Address the person's name. Try to humanize them back into someone who can be reasoned with. It didn't work. He shoved a hand over my mouth and tried to pull me further away from the crew seat, where a sleeping colleague could have heard. The cabin seemed to slow. You describe it later as 2 seconds stretching into eternity, but it's never quite true enough. It was a handful of messy moments where everything felt like cotton, my breath, his thumb, the metallic taste of panic. What saved me was a thing I hadn't expected. Noise. Not noise from me, but the kind of sharp human noise you can't plan. A colleague, a man who worked the sleeper section named Adam, people called him H for an odd nickname he earned on the line, heard scraping and came looking. He didn't hesitate. He burst through the galley door the way someone bursts through film frames. He took one look and moved. I have no way to politely understate what he did. He moved like someone who had practiced more than polite training. He used a technique, my training told me later it was Krav Maga, that caught the assailant off balance and pinned him so quickly that for a moment the air itself seemed to reset. There was a scuffle, hands grabbed, a chair smashed backward. The man hit his head on the galley lip. Adam hit with a controlled ferocity that left no room for ambiguity. It was brutal and necessary. Passengers woke. The cabin became a courtroom. Light flashed from phones like a jury. Adam wrestled him down. We used zip ties, those awful little strips that have both a practical and symbolic weight in a tight spot, to restrain his wrists. The crew called ahead. The captain put the plane on a priority landing. The rest of the flight was an odd, suspended thing, the engines loud, the restrained man hissing like a cornered animal. He spat accusations and denials. He shouted that I was someone else. He shouted that he'd been wronged. He shouted until he was wheeled off the aircraft by the police at disembarkation. He was arrested. They questioned him. I can't tell you the legal routes that followed because I was a witness, and the paperwork takes forms and time. What I can tell you is this. The man's face as security hauled him away. The way passengers snapped pictures without understanding what sanctity we break in those moments. I can tell you how small the galley felt with Adam's back to me, and how grateful I was in a way that felt like it could never be expressed with mere words. I needed therapy. I say that plainly because the aftercare isn't cinematic. It's a line of appointments with polite people who ask you to repeat what happened in a way that is measured and safe. The trauma sits in the small things, a note folded into a napkin, a glance too long, a hand on your mouth. I had to relearn what normal service felt like. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. and imagine a shadow in the doorway. It took time to be able to walk past a galley without turning my head. Adam and I spoke after. He shrugged when I tried to thank him properly. He told me he'd reacted the way anyone on shift would. He told me he had done training, that it was muscle memory. He told me to take strength from being alive. I told him I would. I hugged him at some point and we both pretended it was nothing. I sent him a chocolate bar later because I thought he deserved sugar, and because human gratitude is mostly snacks. Airlines reviewed procedures. The company put up posters about reporting odd notes. They tightened crew pairing for night flights. They gave us forms to fill out, meetings to attend, and a lot of corporate speak about zero tolerance. But those policies never quite reach the moment someone steps into the galley and decides they can breach the thin membrane between service and violence. Procedure is necessary, but not sufficient. What stayed with me was the napkin. That little scrap of paper carried an enormous weight. It taught me that threats are sometimes whispers and sometimes handwriting. It taught me that you can be in a tube of recycled air and still be profoundly vulnerable. People asked whether I pressed charges. I did what everyone in my position does. I cooperated. The police took me through statements. The process was clinical and exhausting. The man, Ian, was taken into custody. He was charged. That was the end of what I could see. What happened after the courtroom filings is outside my hands, and I'm content to leave it there. My job is to serve and to keep people safe. That night, I did both poorly and well in different measures, and I still think about what might have happened if Adam hadn't come in. The gratitude runs deep. The trauma runs deep. Those feelings coexist, like two people who refuse to sit at the same table politely. I still fly, I still wear the uniform, I still pass the galley with more attention than I used to. But there's a line of light that runs through my memory, and it goes to the moment a colleague chose to move and changed what could have been a headline into a closed case. Transition. If the cabin taught one thing, it's that help sometimes comes from the nearest person with the courage to act. The coma ward taught me another lesson. Not all crises announce themselves in time. Sometimes the body decides for you. Story 5. The coma ward. The nurse who found the whisperer. Nights on a ward teach you to listen to silence. It's a different silence than a street at 2 a.m. There's a mechanical hum, the slow beep of monitors, the soft scrape of plastic trays. In the coma unit, voices are softer, almost reverent. You move like you're trying not to disturb something sacred. I worked long nights on the neurology floor. The patients were mostly hooked into machines and into other people's hopes. You learn to be present without being intrusive, to monitor without assuming you know what a sleeping person needs. The woman in bed A had been there for a long time. She was young, too young for the sterile language they use, and her family camped in chairs like a small, quiet congregation. We watched the machines and checked pupils and changed lines. We kept charts, we gave meds, and we tried to print small decencies into long, slow days. My shift was the kind that makes you think you are close to the pulse of humanity. Night gave me the chance to notice the small things the day staff miss. A folded photograph under a pillow, a favorite mug by the sink, a knitted blanket with frayed edges that someone had brought in a month ago. I found comfort in those small acts. The ward felt like a place where time respectfully slowed. Then I saw him. He looked like a thin smudge in the corridor, black jacket, a hood that hid his face. He moved like someone trying not to be noticed, and at first I thought he was a visitor on a strange schedule. Visitors sometimes forget the clock. Maybe he was a relative who kept late hours. Maybe he had come to speak to a comatose mother in a way that made sense to him. He stood by bed A and whispered into the patient's ear. Whispering to the comatose is common. People say the things they couldn't when their friend was awake. They confess, they read books, they sing songs that are private and strange. I watched him for a moment. His voice was a hiss, and he seemed to lean close like someone attaching a battery to a delicate machine. Something in me moved. Maybe it was a footnote on my training that told me to question anyone whose hands were hidden. Maybe it was the fact that the ward has rules about visitors at night and how many people can be by a bed. Whatever it was, I approached. "Excuse me, sir?" I asked, soft enough not to break the hush. "My name is Yavon," I said later to the incident report, and I introduced myself the way nurses do, gentle, firm. The man lifted his head slowly. He wore a thin mask, some kind of medical or theatrical contraption that hid his features. His eyes were bright and urgent. He said he was there for his grandmother. People give you 1,000 excuses at night. You open your mouth to verify visiting hours, to ask for ID. He removed the mask, and then the ward changed shape. The moment I saw the face under the mask, it was like a physical crack in the night. He tore off the cloth, and at the same time, something catastrophic happened inside his head. He went pale as milk. His eyes rolled. The motion was not cinematic. It was medical. He collapsed onto the floor, a thin, limp thing, and blood began to come from his orifices in a way that made time stop. There's a clinical way the body betrays itself in catastrophic hemorrhages. It's loud in the way monitors don't like. Gurgle, wet sound, the terrible red bloom that's not for poetry. I called out for help. SOA, another nurse, and the on-call doctor, neurology, poured into the room. We tried the measures you learn in hospital training, airway, breathing, circulation. We followed the protocol. There was no drama we could add that would change the physiology. He was seizing, and then he stopped. As the doctor later explained in the sterile language of charts, he had suffered an aneurysm that bled out. The minor trauma of removing the mask, the movement, maybe even the stress of being confronted, these can all, in some unlucky configurations, trigger catastrophic vascular events. It is a cruel scientific thing how a small motion can be the final act in a chain no one wanted. He died in the corridor with a sock of blood under his head. It sounds grotesque to say it, and I try not to dwell on the image, but the scene lodged itself in me because of the collision of intent and accident. He'd come with a purpose, some privately held thing he needed to tell a comatose woman, and in that intent he disappeared. The patient did not wake at his whispering. She stayed where she was, breathing slow and shallow on the machine that counted her. We called security. We called the police. We filled out forms that asked for the man's name and for emergency contacts. The man had no ID on him when we searched. The hospital eventually found a relative through a combination of fragments and database searches, and we learned that he'd been a troubled man who claimed kinship with the comatose patient. The authorities took a statement. The ward buzzed with the strange gossip hospitals make of things that are both tragic and absurd. Later, the patient's family told us the man had years of mental illness. They believed he'd been there for his grandmother, a way of staying close when the world had stopped offering conventional routes. They said he'd slipped in through a side entrance and whispered memories in the night, perhaps hoping to wake a woman who couldn't be woken. None of that changes the fact that he died in our corridor and that we'd been the ones to put a hand on his chest. The comatose patient remained comatose for a long stretch. She never regained awareness in the way the family hoped. Over the years, she declined and finally died while still technically a patient, a fade-out that people who work in neurology grow used to in the worst way. The family visited less and less. They grieved in slow institutional increments. The ward documented the man's death as a medical event elicited by confrontation. There were coroner's notes, clinical terms, and then the thing closed. For me, the night contradicted itself. The man's act was intrusive, wrong in procedure and in heart, and yet his death felt like an accident of pain. The ward is where people tend to the fragility of edges, and that night the edge came back at us. We tightened visitor policies. Security made rounds. The hospital added a sign about visiting hours and identification. We all said the proper things, that the safety of patients was paramount, that we must protect the vulnerable. Those things are true in a policy sense. They are also a kind of armor against the guilt that sometimes reaches for you when someone dies on your floor. I kept thinking about the whispers. People whisper to the dying all the time. Those whispers are mercy, ritual, comfort. This was a whisper that collided with a broken mind and a vascular catastrophe and turned into something else entirely. It taught me that intention and outcome are not the same. It taught me that your best intention can sometimes be the object of an unpredictable chain. Afterwards, I took leave for a week, because you can't keep working the same nights after a human body explodes in front of you, and you can't put it back together with kindness. I went home and slept in the messy way of people who are allowed to make mistakes and cry about them alone. I sat with the memory of a man removing a mask and collapsing and tried to square it with the person I believed him to be and the person he turned into at the moment his body betrayed him. I still check ID now. I still ask for visitors' names. I still tell families to be mindful. You do the pragmatic thing because the practical helps you sleep. But I also keep the image of that man somewhere guarded, like a study aid you never expect to have to use, but that you suspect will come in handy someday. It's an odd way to collect history, a night sown from small acts and catastrophic endings. Closing. What all nights teach us. 5 nights. 5 variations on the same theme. When most are asleep, the world narrows to a handful of people and a handful of choices. I've told you about a vet who carried a blunt instrument in her kit and a voice that cooled a barn. About a grocery worker who found a man eating octopus at 4 a.m. A 22-year-old behind a gas station counter who watched a scamster pretend to be small and learned how fragile the ledger of fear can be. A flight attendant whose napkin became a threat and whose colleague became a rescuer, and a nurse who watched an intruder die after whispering into the ear of someone already beyond reach. What ties these together isn't just violence. It's the ordinary turned catastrophic. It's the realization that jobs most people sleep through become scenes where ethics and instinct collide. You watch the same fluorescent lights every night, and one night they reveal something that changes the hours that follow. That's the lesson. Night condenses consequence. There are patterns. Isolation matters. Fewer people means fewer witnesses and slower help. Policies matter. Cameras, motion sensors, secure locks, and partnerships with local security can change outcomes. Training matters. De-escalation, restraint, and the courage to act. Those things have a price and a benefit, but none of those things guarantees anything. A camera can fail. A phone might die. A person might misread a note. There's also the human side, that no policy can legislate away. The vet who held a pistol in a barn did it because someone had to. The grocery worker and Cherry tended to each other afterward with coffee and bandages. The gas station attendant rebuilt a life and found a partner in the oddest of ways. The flight attendant got therapy and a friend who intervened, and later a gratitude that never quite covers the ache. The nurse tightened procedures, but also carried the memory of a man who died in the corridor with a whisper on his lips. We don't glorify any of this. We don't make heroes of people who did what they had to, nor do we villainize those who failed beyond what facts allow. We recognize the mess of human life: addiction, grief, psychosis, opportunism. We acknowledge outcomes that don't wrap neatly. Rehab doesn't mean perfection. Psychiatric care doesn't mean restoration. Arrest doesn't mean justice is complete. And death doesn't always teach the lessons we expect. If you work nights, take practical steps. Tell someone where you're going. Keep your phone charged, no exits. Learn basic self-defense or carry non-lethal tools where they're legal and make sense for your environment. Advocate for better staffing. Argue for cameras and for alarm displays, and for a manager who answers the phone at 2 in the morning. Those things won't make you invincible, but they tilt probability in your favor. If you don't work nights, remember that the people you sleep through have their own lives and their own dangers. Be kind. Try to imagine the small, patient bravery it takes to keep another person safe in a long, unlit hour. Support policies that protect workers. Better pay, better staffing, better security. It's not glamorous, but it's life-changing. And for everyone here, be gentle with your reactions. These are true stories from real people. They carry trauma in them. If anything I've said touches a raw place, take a breath. Consider talking to someone. Consider supporting a friend who works late. Final CTA. If you made it this far and you want more of these true night shift stories, subscribe and tell me in the comments which one shocked you most. If you've got your own midnight story, something weird, dangerous, or just plain strange, send it in. We read every submission and we'll tell the best ones with respect and the detail they deserve. Thanks for staying up with me. Be safe out there, whether your work ends at dawn or your watch only begins when the rest of the city sleeps.